From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Stefania Bravo. This is From the South. Uruguay's largest workers' union announced a partial strike on Wednesday to support workers in the natural gas sector in their struggle against Brazilian oil giant Petrobras. The strike was announced after workers reached a standstill in negotiations with Petrobras and after the company confirmed their plans to pull out all operations from Uruguay, which will lead to mass layoffs. Workers affected by these events have been on hunger strike for over 20 days. Unions have confirmed that their strike will be ongoing until the negotiations continue. Our correspondent in Uruguay, Mateo Grillen, has more.
Thousands of people have joined the protests taking place in the city center of Montevideo, which is part of the national strike by labor unions against the gas company Petrobras. Gas workers have also been on a hunger strike for 23 days. Petrobras has not replied to the workers' demands, which include no more layoffs and new negotiations after the company announced that it is leaving the country. Labor unions came to the capital to demand a meeting with the president, Tabaré Vázquez, and to give him a document asking the government to intervene in the process in order to minimize the consequences of the company leaving the country. The workers also want to discuss a way that they can keep their jobs. The president has not responded to workers' demands. This conflict between workers and Petrobras has been going on for several months, and it got more tense in the last weeks after the company announced plans to fire 50 workers, or 1/3 of the entire staff.
We thank Mateo for that report. Teachers are marching in Ecuador to protest against labor reforms demanded by the International Monetary Fund. Several hundred retired teachers are marching through the center of Quito to the presidential palace. They are demanding that they receive their benefits in full. The protest is part of a mounting wave of discontent among workers over the government's economic policies.
More protests are planned in the coming days against the government of Ecuador, this time over the labor reforms announced by the government's Work and Wages Council. For the trade unions, these reforms correspond to conditions imposed by the International Monetary Fund.
We want him to face a motion of censure before the National Assembly so that he can be sacked for not obeying the laws.
The government is proposing 3 labour reforms relating to special contracts for new businesses, fixed-term contracts and the regulation of the working week. The unions are already taking action, including a protest by teachers this Wednesday where they're demanding the removal of the Minister of Finance.
It's not right for the government to sign this letter of intent behind the backs of people and the workers. This means counter-reforms agree to suit the bankers and businessmen at home and abroad.
They're not the only ones. The Foot Union Federation, until recently an ally of the government, is also proposing escalating protests.
It's not just these 3 reforms. They are planning to roll back other rights too. That's why we are calling for action on the 6th of June as part of the preparation for a national strike. Pensioners will start a hunger strike to demand that get paid. Transporter workers will strike on the 11th of June, a series of actions leading to the big national strike.
One of the most controversial points in these reforms is that the current trial period of 3 months for new employees could be extended to 3 years. The unions say that means they could be sacked without any right to compensation.
Vamos a pausa. Venezuela's health minister points to U.S. and European sanctions for the... Well, let's take a short break now. We'll be back. Welcome back. Venezuela's health minister points to U.S. and European sanctions for the ongoing shortages of medicine and health equipment in the Bolivarian nation. Minister Carlos Alvarado held a news conference at the UN in Geneva, Switzerland, as the World Health Assembly is being held. He said that to remedy the effects of the economic war, the Venezuelan government has turned to their allies as they seek to find alternative ways to importing medicine. Alvarado says all 300 Venezuelan hospitals continue functioning, but that the greatest threat to health for the Venezuelan people is being posed by the U.S. government.
The blockade has made it so that Venezuela is facing a difficult situation in terms of health. There have been some diseases that have resurfaced, like, for example, cases of measles. On top of this, 2 million euros are frozen, which we specifically set apart for the purchase of vaccines through the Pan American Health Organization. So what are we doing in Venezuela to overcome this situation? We are not standing by with our arms crossed. We are strengthening our alliances with countries like Cuba, China, Turkey, Russia, Palestine, and Iran, among others.
And on behalf of the non-aligned movement, the Venezuelan health minister also called for the international community to join efforts to end Israeli violations of the rights to health of the occupied Palestinian people.
We reiterate our urgent call to put an end to the Israeli occupation of occupied Palestine, territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, in accordance with international law, international humanitarian law, human rights, and the relevant United Nations resolutions. We call on member states and international organizations to join our call to put an end to the violations of the rights to health of the occupied Palestinian people, and to remove the blockade and provide relevant assistance.
More than 2,000 students are taking part in the 18th edition of the Latin American and Caribbean Student Congress taking place in Venezuela. The focus of the Congress this year will be discussions about foreign interventionism and the reality of Venezuela as opposed to the narrative spread by the mainstream media.
This is a Congress which brings together students from all across Latin America and the Caribbean. The 18th edition of the Latin American and Caribbean Student Congress was born in Havana in 1966. In its 2019 edition, the International Forum will allow participants to discover the reality of Venezuela, as opposed to the falsehoods spread by the mainstream media.
Haiti and Venezuela are linked historically. We have always supported one another. Haitians strongly support the Venezuelan people, their sovereignty, and ongoing fight.
Like any other year, the event looks to encourage a discussion on regional topics and challenges, as well as the role of student movements from Latin America and the Caribbean. As part of the discussion, participants expand their understanding of achievements made in the protection of education by the Venezuelan government, despite an illegal economic blockade by the United States.
We identify with the Bolivarian Revolution. In Nicaragua, they tried to carry out a coup d'etat last year. But we Nicaraguans were able to defend our country and our model of free education and health. In Venezuela, they have the same model. These systems are not approved by the U.S.
Colombian students were also present in this event. During this 18th edition of the CLI, students came to a consensus on the urgency to stop attacks by the U.S. government against Venezuela.
We are the sons and daughters of Bolívar. We are children of the great nation. We are here to talk about education and to send a message to the entire continent to stop this aggression the Venezuelan people are suffering under.
The international delegations will participate in a series of activities until May 25th, with a goal of coming to a robust understanding of the reality in Venezuela as learned through people-to-people exchanges, both with other foreign delegations and through the Venezuelan people themselves.
In Barbados, the government's recent passing grade for meeting IMF fiscal targets has failed to impress opposition lawmakers. Senator Crystal Drake says while the Mia Mottley administration may have hit the IMF benchmarks, it is ignoring the social cost. She says in reducing debt and closing the fiscal gap, Barbadians had to give up their wealth, particularly vulnerable groups such as pensioners. The opposition senator noted the recent 75% increase in bus fares, together with tax and layoffs within the public sector.
So for me,
The Caribbean Examination Council, or CXC, is set to consider a petition calling for all students to resit the 2019 CSEC math exam following alleged exam regulation breaches. Last week, CXC announced it was investigating the breach, which is alleged to have taken place in Trinidad and Tobago. Images circulating on social media show students using mobile phones and textbooks during the exam. CXC is an examining body that provides educational certifications in 16 Caribbean countries and has replaced the London exam certification. Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley says her island is committed to regional air travel and to cash-strapped regional airline Liat. Recent reports say that Barbados is to sell almost all of its shares in Liat to Antigua Barbuda, where the airline is based.
Barbados is committed to Liat and regional air travel. We may not be committed to Liat 1974 Limited, and that's the fundamental difference. And there's more than one way to do that which we have to do. But at the appropriate time, with respect to the details of any discussions, I'm not going to disrespect the process. I'm not going to disrespect the people with whom we do business. There is a right way to do things, and I will follow that right way.
A 75-year-old medical doctor has been killed in a robbery near his Wallerfield home in Trinidad. Dr. Vin Sain Chiang walked out of his house at 5 a.m. on Wednesday, telling his wife that he was heading towards the capital city. Two men then reportedly confronted the 75-year-old as he stood next to his pickup van. Shortly after, a commotion was heard during which Dr. Chiang was fatally shot. Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holmes has allocated an additional $18 million to address water issues. This means a total of $92 million will now be made available for the trucking of water to areas affected by the water crisis. The National Water Commission has also been directed to conduct a review that would give rise to the expansion of raw water storage and increased availability of raw water. Water levels at the Moner Reservoir and Hermitage Dam are down to just over 27% and 33% of their capacities. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Minister of Health of the Democratic Republic of Congo has called for community engagement to curb the current Ebola epidemic. Following warnings about the Ebola virus by the World Health Organization, the DRC's Minister of Health called on humanitarian organizations working to control the virus to engage communities. The WHO previously attributed the challenge in accessing communities due to various armed conflicts.
To improve community engagement in the fight against Ebola, I believe that it is also necessary for all those involved to respect communities and especially to listen to them. We must not ask ourselves what else do we have to do. We must ask ourselves how to do it better, by first listening to the communities.
At least 26 people have been killed in the Central African Republic following an attack by an armed group. The attack took place in two different villages on Wednesday. The massacre is the single bloodiest incident since the government agreed to a peace deal with 14 militia groups in February. Thousands of supporters of Guinea-Bissau's ruling party have protested, calling on the president to nominate the party's leader as prime minister after an election victory in March. President José Mario Vaz said last week that he wasn't ready to nominate Domingos Simoes Pereira as prime minister. Pereira was fired in 2015 due to deepening power struggles in Vaz. Wednesday's protest coincided with a new three-day strike of public sector workers over unpaid wages and worsening working conditions. The United Nations is starting to pay attention to the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon, a conflict that has pitted the country's English-speaking regions against a government dominated by French speakers. Our correspondent, Matuba Malachi, explains.
The conflict in Cameroon's Anglophone areas has pitted Cameroon's two English-speaking regions, the northwest and the southwest, against the country's Francophone, which is dominated by government forces. this very same conflict has received very little or no international attention at all. But we've seen the United Nations Security Council starting to pay attention to the crisis that's taking place in Cameroon. It was only in this month of May that the world body decided to start addressing the crisis for the first time in an informal meeting on the conflict that has displaced more than 500,000 people over the past 20 months. Now, the discontent among Anglophone citizens started back in 2016, but these were just normal protests that we see in any democracy, that people will be complaining about service delivery and so forth. But things changed a little bit in late 2017 when President Paul Biya's government responded to a non-violent protest with force. So Cameroonian security in 2017 fired live ammunition from low-flying helicopters into crowds that were protesting then. And videos circulated of them beating demonstrators around the southwest and those regions that are francophone. And that's when it became clear the government in Yaoundé had no intention entertaining Anglophone demands. And that's how a lot of political analysts and a lot of political commentators say that's where separatist movement got their inspiration for self-determination, because they were not getting any joy from President Paul Biya's government. And we are seeing armed groups that are vying to lead the country's secessionist movement, which, despite its fragmentation, is becoming increasingly resourceful. And that may be a problem for Paul Biya's government. Back to you, studio.
We thank Matuba for that report. Protesters in Sudan have vowed to continue demonstrating in the streets to demand a civilian rule. The protesters have urged both their leaders and the military council to commit to finding a solution. They've threatened more demonstrations if civilian rule is not established. The two sides launched a round of new talks late Sunday over the Sovereign Council to rule Sudan for a 3-year transitional period following last month's ouster of President Omar al-Bashir.
Everyone should be flexible in negotiating, whether the military council or the opposition forces, to get out of the crisis. If the demonstrators continue to escalate and put pressure on the civil disobedience, this may give the opportunity to the detractors of the revolution to lure us towards violence.
South African newly elected members of parliament have elected Cyril Ramaphosa as president during their first post-election sitting. Just before, lawmakers were sworn in for this new period, with the ruling African National Congress taking 230 out of the 400 seats in parliament.
Everybody knows that we've got to do this work, and that's precisely what we're working on now. And we will present an outcome that I think our country will welcome and will be pleased with, because it will have a very good balance of gender, youth, competence, demographic, regional spread, and all that. So that's what we are going to.
And the South African president congratulated the opposition for the campaign and the results in the polls. Cyril Ramaphosa shook hands with the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema, who won 44 seats.
Okay. Well, congratulations. Oh, thank you. You give Lela deputy. Okay. For no, this should mean not anymore. Jealous down. Yeah. Jealous down.
The European Union's parliamentary elections are set to take place between May 23rd and the 26th. Political parties are wrapping up their campaigns with the threat of the far right making big gains across the continent.
The far right flexed its muscles last Saturday with a mass demonstration in the streets of Milan, Italy. The rain stopped the rally from being larger, but it did not prevent far-right Italian leader Matteo Salvini from attacking Brussels.
There is no far-right political party here. What we have is politics led by common sense. The true extremists are those that have precariously ruled Europe for 20 years.
11 European political parties stood alongside Salvini, all with the same ideology. They spoke out against what they termed irregular immigration and the Islamization of Europe. Meanwhile, Salvini's French ally, Marine Le Pen, criticized the continent as a whole.
The European Union is killing Europe, and the evidence lies with Brexit.
Surveys say Salvini's alliance could become the fourth largest bloc in the new European Parliament. Meanwhile, the far-right Spanish party called Vox was not at the rally. Analysts say their message was simpler.
So essentially is this nationalism which is very basic and is built on anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, anti-women, anti-gay.
Spanish people are buying into the agenda. However, a great deal of the population remains skeptical.
They are trying to paint migrants as foreigners that are taking our money, when in actuality, migrants have done a lot for this country. They contributed to the labor force and renovated the Spanish population. So, their campaign message goes against the very people who have helped us for so long. Our country is the way it is because of them. It's absurd to throw stones on our own roof.
Immigration, the far right, security and Brexit are some of the challenges that are at the forefront of the European Union's elections. Other issues include the identity crisis faced by the Union and its institutions. On this basis, EU leaders are calling on voters to cast their ballots.
Déconstruire le projet européen.
We can deconstruct the European project by returning to nationalism, or we can rebuild a more ambitious project for the 21st century, in an uncertain world influenced by geopolitical risk and tensions between the US and China. Evidently, I think we share the same deep sentiment. That union makes us stronger.
This election will see citizens in the United Kingdom vote, while it has one foot outside the European Union.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesperenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesper English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.